Okay.
But don't go farther than that.
All right. All right. Okay.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we like to start the presentation from Mr. Ken Winkler about Evens-Wentz. Luckily, we found somebody what was taking care of a lot of historical information about Evens-Wentz, because in Europe we know his book, of course, but background information becomes more and more too unknown, and maybe we are on the edge of losing some information. So we are very happy to have you here, because we expect a better background information that we had already. You are open for questions. Do you prefer it on the end, or can we jump to
You can ask questions at any time, please. If something isn't
Okay.
clear or you have an objection or a correction or an addition, please feel free.
But I have learned that your limit is by 3 o'clock.
By 3, yeah.
Okay, good. We will respect that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, go ahead, please.
Okay. Thank you for having me today. Evans-Wentz is quite an anomaly and quite a famous person here in San Diego at times. That's him on your right, stage left. He put together several books during his lifetime. He's known mostly for the Tibetan Book of the Dead, his first in the Tibetan series. There's 4 of them on that. Currently, there's a Oxford University Press newer edition, 2000, with a foreword and afterword by Donald Lopez, an American academician. This wasn't his main work. In fact, he surprised everybody toward the end of his life by when he, right before he died, so to speak, Tibetan Book of Great Liberation. There was one small section in there that he thought was the distillation of everything he had been doing all his life. And he sort of encapsulated it into nothing save mind is conceivable. Now, before we get into that, let me give you some of his background. He had 4 different periods in his life where the influences basically directed him. He was a Stanford graduate around the time of the San Francisco earthquake. Up until that point, he had grown up in New Jersey, somewhat precocious young man, given over to wandering around by himself, thinking of spiritual matters. That seems kind of strange, but however, in America, in the late 1800s, there was a great spiritual renaissance. There have been several of them during our history. Starting in about 1848, when you had the spirit knocks coming, all of a sudden, people said, oh, there's another part of life. And then the Civil War came along, one of the first industrial-based slaughters, and then all of a sudden, people started getting more concerned. Well, what happened to our relatives, our friends, our loved ones? So more and more interest in spiritualism was developing. As you well realize in your own history, about this time, Madame Blavatsky brought out the Secret Doctrines. This was very, very important information to people. They had never heard anything like this. A lot of the spiritual writing at the time was sort of oblique. Some of it was deadening. Some of it was completely indecipherable. But all of a sudden, with the Secret Doctrines, we had a language. And for Evans-Wentz, this was unbelievable. Language. Well, up until that point, other than reading these spiritualist tracts, he basically was studying the Bible. And it wasn't enough for him. But however, he kept studying it, studying it, studying it, and reading the commentaries on it. And one of the things that bothered him quite a bit was that what became the Catholic Church in the Second Council of Constantinople, they basically suppressed the Gnostic tradition. And it wasn't until our generation that the Gnostic Gospels came to light, so we understood what was lost. But at the time of Evans-Wentz's understanding of it, they were getting hints that maybe these people, the Gnostics, had something more going, something more that maybe spoke of what Madame Blavatsky was talking about. And so he started becoming almost ethereal at the age of 16 and 17. He decided he had to understand occult philosophy. At 17, this is quite a step. I haven't been able to find any of the tracts that he was reading, but in his papers at Stanford University, there's a big, thick folder full of the modern ones. So I think he had never lost his interest in what the possibilities were. This is what he looked like about the time he entered Stanford University. But before that happened, he and his father were real estate speculators in Florida. This is where he made his money. And he got to be very good at this. It kind of bothered him because he was busy renouncing the world, but he also was helping his father amass this real estate. And he thought this was quite good. So he wasn't really sure what to do with all this. So his father was really quite a traveler, and he ended up in San Diego. Well, as you know, what happened in San Diego in the late 1800s, Loma land had been developed. And Evans-Wentz was quite aware of this, very aware. He had been completely taken by the idea of the universal brotherhood. And this was important to him because he felt that modern-day Christianity and current governments and such were really not speaking to the inner being, not really helping the world. And he felt that Catherine Tingley, when she started this with the Raja Yoga, with the publishing, with every part of the programs, this was the ideal that he wanted. This is what he needed. And he was very anxious to become a member, which at the time was not necessarily inexpensive. Well, he had the money. And so he went ahead and joined. He said, I can't wait. Then he became a member. Then he got depressed. He said, these are for elites. He never said that about Catherine Tingley, but he said, all these rich people. Well, what am I going to do? I could become a rancher. No, I could go back to Florida and speculate. Or I could go to Stanford University. Or I could stay here and really work with Loma land. And evidently his father had said a few things like, calm down. So he decided to ask Catherine Tingley, who was really a guru to him. And she said, go to Stanford. You can always come back to Loma land. He had a small house on the outskirts. He said, okay, I'll go there. And all of a sudden he went to Stanford, and the next stage of his life took over. Because Stanford made me. That's what he told his friends. That's what he told his family. That's what he told his last secretary. Stanford made me. And here it was, this young man, he was trying to renounce the world, all of a sudden became Mr. Social. There are pictures in the archives at Stanford University showing him in these dapper-looking suits, a little straw hat and everything, in the company of young women. He had already renounced marriage, mind you. And he was just he was the head of the English school club. He had a social service club. He was doing this, doing that, always taking the ferry over to Berkeley for games and dances. And so all of a sudden the earthquake came along and it galvanized him. He almost was killed during it. And then he did guard duty at the university. He did guard duty in San Francisco. He distributed milk and bread and such. He thought this was a great idea. Well, in addition to that part of his life, he studied with William Butler Yeats and William James and in Stanford. And one thing that William James had done with the varieties of religious experience, that was his book, he basically sort of focused the young Evans-Wentz on other possibilities. Yeats himself was in the forefront of Celtic revival, of studying the fairy faith and such. And so he basically assisted Evans-Wentz in focusing on another aspect. So what happens? As soon as he gets out of Stanford, off he goes to Oxford. And this was the next big step in his life. Oxford, oh my gosh, what is he going to do there? He had 2 or 3 Celtic scholars that he studied with, and they directed him toward going on foot, by cart, train where he could, interviewing all of these peasants in Brittany, Cornwall, Ireland, Scotland, wherever he could find them, getting the information for the fairy faith. So here we had the theosophical literature, spiritual literature, one part of his brain. Now we started getting the fairy faith stuff. And so this was heady things. He brought out a book called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, this huge tome that a just unbelievable amount of energy and time went into that. So this is pretty good stuff. It immediately went out of print. In fact, it was reissued about 20 years ago, and Kathleen Raine, the Blake scholar and poet, said she really appreciated what he had done, because nobody at that time was going around house to house to house out in the middle of nowhere asking about the fairy faith. She said more modern ways of doing this were now in existence because they had different ways of understanding how to do it. Also, more Gaelic speakers were going out there and getting the information, and so the remaining Gaelic speakers that were still alive, they were telling them more. Didn't bother Evans-Wentz. Okay, here he got his degree, got his book published. He took off for Europe, and the surviving journal entries and photographs, he looks just like a tourist all over the place. He didn't like how loose the living was in Europe at that time. He didn't like the casinos down in the south. He didn't like some of the tourist traps. And he just went over and over, just like a young man on a grand tour. Well, part of the grand tour was in 1914, September, and by that time World War I had started, so we weren't at war, so he just said, well, I'm going to sit this one out. He went down to Egypt and spent 3 years in Egypt, studying hieroglyphics, studying the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and anything else he could find. And one of his friends was T.E. Lawrence. And at one time, believe it or not, he was going to go off with T.E. Lawrence on the camels out into the desert. And when I read that in a letter that Lawrence had sent him, saying, well, no, it's not that important, blah, blah, that's okay. Why don't you go to India? And so everyone said, okay, go to India. So he went to India. And I thought, this is getting better and better. So he went to Ceylon first. Nice place to go. And he went around, again, like the tourist and everything, taking pictures and some of the surviving photographs of the jungle areas and the old temples. Unbelievably beautiful. They're still up in Stanford. And then he went over to India itself. And you can probably guess he went to Adyar. Now, as you realize, there was a great rift between the Adyar Theosophist and Madame Tingling. I won't go into that. I'm sure you all are aware of that. Well, he was aware of it, but I wasn't sure what he went to Adyar for, as a peace offering or what. And he thought, well, they're Theosophists, I'll go there. Well, he had to wait to see Annie Besant. She had an entourage that kept him away. So he sat there, and journal entry after journal entry was all the bickering and backbiting, and he was, this is terrible. This isn't the Theosophy that I know, type of thing. So he finally got to meet Annie Besant, and he was like, again, another guru. This is a person, as far as he was concerned, that was well above the rest of humanity. And he asked her, he says, well, I heard there is a reincarnation of Madame Blavatsky around, and Colonel Olcott, do you know anything about them? She said nothing. And he said, well, I'm from Loma land, and nothing. And so, that sort of ended that part. So he took off, went up to the Himalayas and looked around and everything, went over to Calcutta, which at this time, at the end, it just shifted as far as a political capital, but it was still a vibrant culture in Calcutta in the late teens. And people said, oh, why don't you go up to Darjeeling, look around. Third part started. He went to Darjeeling, met a man named Sardar Bahadur Laidlaw, an exceptional gentleman who was well trusted by the Dalai Lama, the Tibetan government, and the British government. And at this time, Evans-Wentz, who was a pack rat, he got unbelievable amount of things he collected. He got this Tibetan Book of the Dead manuscript. What am I going to do with this? So Laidlaw says, go over to Sikkim. There's a guy named, what's his name, Lama Kaza Dawa Samdup. He can help you. So he went over there and think, okay, just one more person to see. Now, Evans-Wentz just went from point to point to point to point like this all the time. It was exhausting. And this was at a time when it was not easy to go around India. So he pulls into Gantok, Sikkim. Well, here I am. He knew the previous Maharaja. They had been in Oxford together. His brother was now the crown prince. And he said, oh, yeah, you can go see this guy. And he kept pushing him away, like, go over there. So he went over there and said, well, I have this manuscript. And Sandup said, I have a manuscript. And so for several months, they sat there and they translated, and they translated, and they translated. Now, Evans-Wentz said, I was his disciple. Sandup said, basically, he was my dictionary. So I don't know what to make of it. So as far as being a practitioner of anything right now, at this stage, he was nothing. He had the tenets of spiritualism, of Theosophy, of the fairy faith, which he liked. He understood some parts of Gnostic Christianity, and all of a sudden here comes this Tibetan Buddhism. And this is a lot. So he also got several manuscripts translated that Sandup himself had translated, called became Tibetan Yoga, Secret Yoga and Doctrines. I think that's it. And this was Tibetan Secret Yoga. This is this Tibetan Book of the Dead, and also the Milarepa biography. So he said, this is really hot stuff. Well, he took off, another one of us taking off, after about a year with Sandup, took off back to Rishikesh. This man, and Sama Satyananda, who had had a little hut on the banks of the Ganges, that Evans-Wentz bought 10 acres there. He was also a property collector, and spent several months there trying to practice the yoga. Now, I don't know what it all meant. Now, Satyananda said, okay, you got to sit. There's 4 hours at a time. You got to do your breathing, and you got to think this, you got to do this, you got to empty this. So Evans-Wentz, and there's pictures of him, believe it or not, in a little Indian dhoti, sitting in front of his hut for hours at a time. Well, 2 anyway. And so he described the area as incredible. There was nothing around. Nowadays, it's full of tourists. So all of a sudden now he had a little bit of Tibetan Buddhism. He was familiar with the tenets of Buddhism through the secret doctrines. But now he had this yoga. So what am I going to do with it? Instead of asking Sandup, basically, what do I do? He went to a Hindu sadhu and said, well, what am I going to do with this? So he went ahead and started practicing it. Now, if you look in the book, his secret yoga book, these 6 yogas that he talks about, he went to several Hindu holy men and say, what am I going to do? What can I learn and all this sort of thing? And basically, it had been yoga that had been taken from India up in Tibet, changed around a bit, and then became something else entirely. But he just had all this information just stacked up there. Now, India had completely intrigued him. In fact, a lot of the older theosophists I met 30 years ago told me who their children during at the Raja school said he would lecture about, they used to call him New India, because that's all he would talk about. Come on, let's go to New India. And a lot of them wondered if anybody ever followed him over there. But here he was in India itself getting all this information. And, you know, what is he going to do with all that stuff? He still wasn't sure. So he went back to England, taking all of his stuff with him. He loved to go on, well, he loved to go on ships because that was the only way you could go, but you could take these big trunks full of stuff. And that's what he would do. And he would deposit it at Jesus College, Oxford. In fact, when I did my research there, I didn't know how much he had left there until after I left. They sent me a list. Now, the Bodleian Library at Oxford has all of his papers, but the Ashmolean Museum has all his junk. And I mean, it is unbelievable. Little votive offerings from Ceylon, various statues, palm leaf manuscripts. They just dumped them at Jesus College, and they gave them to the Ashmolean after he died. And I don't know what happened to them. He had a locker filled of stuff in Stanford when he died, and what happened there was it disappeared, including 20 precious tonkas. I know where 2 of them are, so obviously some of them somebody did something they shouldn't have. Ashmolean Museum, I think, is a little bit more responsible about that. So he developed a trajectory. India, Oxford, San Diego. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so what he picked up during this time is uncertain, because he talked about an incredible number of things in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. As far as what influenced him, what the main footnotes here are based on Greek literature, Greek mythology, some Roman mythology, some spiritual writing, and a beginning growing number of anthropological studies done by Indians and by Brits. And so I was thinking, I was trying to see, well, how much did he take from the Theosophical situations, any of the documentation? It was there. If you look in parts of the Secret Doctrines, you can see some of the things that were discussed there and covered there. He basically had gone one step further. Because when Madame Blavatsky talked about the Mahatmas, okay, as far as he was concerned, after being with Dawa Sandup, is that they were Tibetan masters, of course. And so nobody really refuted that. In fact, when he talked to Evans-Wentz talked to Sandup about this, Sandup said, oh, she probably was in Tashi Lampo when she was up in Tibet. And there he goes. He writes it all down. Yeah, well, this looks good enough. Okay, fine. And so 1927, he brings out Tibetan Book of the Dead. The next year, he brings out Milarepa's biography. It's not as strong a book. And I don't think he was very proud of it. He quoted at several points in the last two books, but he went on from there. And then the Tibetan Book of Yoga, I think that came out in 34. So what he was collecting was a great number of people sort of on his periphery. He never was one to stay in one place long enough to really get a following, you might say. He would end up in Oxford. He may spend up to a year before some of his stuff was published there. He just sat in the Bodleian Library and researched and researched and researched. And then he would take off again. He built a house in the Himalayas in a place called Almora. This is what he was looking like at the time right now. But this was in the 20s, 30s? 20s, okay. He didn't change that much. He just got a little bit more wrinkle as he got older and grayer hair and a little more thin, but that's okay. And so in this place of Almora, and this is the upper lane in Almora. It's 2 levels. The bottom level is the main road, and it's horrible. Bottom level hasn't changed in 100 years. Top level hasn't changed in 100 years. You can still walk along that top lane up there. You can hear looms. You can see these sannyasis, Hindu holy men, sitting in the little coffee shops up there. And when the electricity is turned off, which is quite often, it's a medieval village. And he liked that. So he went out on this little ridge to the east of there. Well, this is where he lived the last years of in San Diego. Went out this little road. This is right down the road from his place. And he built a little stone house. And he spent only 1 year there. It was cold. You can't believe how cold it is. You think it's cold here sometimes. It's dry cold. But there, you have all these winds blowing off the Himalayas. It's about 100 miles north of here. You can barely see the outlines. Himalayas, right, Nanda Devi is just over my left shoulder, so to speak, here, out of this picture. And so he couldn't handle it. So he would take off, come back, spend a month in a good season, come back. So here we have the overlays. So now what's going to happen? Okay. Well, maybe he should be stationary. It was getting to be 1936, 37, 38. He was in Oxford in 38. He met Carl Jung, who's done several of his several commentaries on his books. Then he's back in Almora. Okay, here we are. We're going to be back. I'll stay here. And all of a sudden they realize, I may get stuck here. Already there were great numbers of refugees in Almora, in India, from Europe, thinking, we know what's going on. So he was a little dense about this. Well, he thought that his finances may be cut off. because from the time of Oxford until the end of the 30s, he was getting about $1,600 a month from his dad, rentals. That was a kingly sum. He was living on $100 a month in Egypt with a cook and with a translator and a house. That's everything. Wasn't much more in India, so all that money went into buying land out east of here at Takati Mountain. But he got scared, and he took off, came back home, went into the, go back that one. The hotel. He went back there and said, okay, I'm going to stay right here, and he ended his days there. Whether he lived there because he didn't have the money or he thought he was only going to take off in a moment. He spent over 20 years there. He stayed there mainly. Right down the corner was the San Diego Public Library. My aunt was one of the librarians at the time, and they thought he was putting them on. He'd go in there and take out his own books. Because to put this one together, the last book, he needed to quote from his own, and he had given them all away. So, and he'd go in again. My aunt said she just wouldn't say a word. They just, look at that, he's getting his book again, show off. But he didn't have anything. Also, about 2 blocks away was the House of Nutrition, the only natural food restaurant, vegetarian restaurant in San Diego for years and years and years. And it was really a very kind of a formal place. The women who worked there were all in these almost looked like hospital worker uniforms, I remember. I used to go in there as a kid because I loved the health shakes. I don't know what they were, but I thought they had to be good. But he'd be sitting there. I know he had to be because he went there once a day. And he'd just be eating a salad maybe once a day. It was very sparse. He was very thin. He had had malaria a few times and it bothered him. And he'd take off to go out to his house out by Takati Mountain and stay there for several weeks, then come back into the Keystone Hotel and back and forth and back and forth. At this time, he was studying the American Indians, mainly because of Takati Mountain, which is called Kuchama, was one of 4 mountains that were considered sacred by the Degüeño Indians. And naturally, being thorough, he wanted to take a look at this. And so he looked very closely at this and wrote people and went around asking questions and things. And his last book, Kuchama and Sacred Mountains, came out after he died. So we have these 4 overlays. We basically have the spiritualism, and we have the theosophical literature. We have Stanford and Oxford, fairy faith. Then you have India, which is Tibetan Buddhism, and then you have the American Indians. Now, a lot of people have complained about him being somewhat incomplete as a scholar. If you read his introductions, which take time, he's very, very thorough, he basically disavows any special place for him. He said he's only been like a mouthpiece for the masters, for his teachers, for all the things that he's learned. And he always said there's going to be, in later years, other interpretations. Because remember, when this thing came out, there was absolutely nothing he could do to cross-reference it. Nothing. Nowadays, Tibetology is unbelievably dense, widespread. You can check back 50 years to this time and get your information. There are any number of Tibetan teachers here in the West that can explain things. At that time, he only had novice Endup and a couple of people from Goom Monastery outside of Darjeeling, and that was it. And these people weren't Tibetan. Well, some were Tibetans, most of them were Lepkas. They were tribal people, Tibetan tribal types. And so, where does that leave him? He basically introduced all of this to us. I have heard Tibetan teachers quote from some of the yoga doctrines that he wrote about, quoted from the Tibetan Book of Great Liberation, using different names for things, for lack of a better word. And I realized that the names he gave them are not necessarily the understood names that a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner would use. his rendition of Tibetan, I have a hard time looking at it because pronunciation is difficult enough. But it didn't seem to correspond with what some of my teachers had told me. But I realized that they had taken some of this information. So what he has done was the first person to give us all this stuff. So now it's up to you. It's interesting that Tibetan Book of the Dead has had at least a half dozen people bring out variations on this. All of them have commentaries equal to his, if not more. Some of them completely try and discredit him. But the Tibetans never discredited him. He was a pioneer. He was basically someone who took a terma, a missing secret document, and made it public again. In fact, the Dalai Lama, when he, about 25 years ago, when he started doing the teachings, he was taking some of the teachings that he talked about, Evans-Wentz talked about in these books, and were making public because he didn't want them to die. Because when Tibet was invaded, a lot of that was lost. Some of it was brought out. They've been translating it for the last 25 years, and some of the better teachers have been using it. And that's what Evans-Wentz saved. His manuscripts are still at Stanford. There are some in Oxford. Other ones are scattered around. But he influenced a great number of people, including myself. I had no idea what I was getting into when I studied his life, because it basically took me to Loma land, to Stanford, to Oxford, to India. And I'm far from finishing that, but I owe him a debt of gratitude. And basically, he owed a debt of gratitude to all of his teachers, including Theosophists, including the Buddhists, whoever else came along that was willing to help him. He was the most amazing man. I remember once he came into a friend's house sniffing, looking for the right spiritual vibrations. My friend said, "Oh, this is crazy." But he did it every time he went in the house. And then when he was too old to take care of himself at the hotel, he moved up to the Self-Realization Fellowship in Encinitas. And he was assigned a man, Blevins, to be his secretary. He had known Paramahansa Yogananda's guru back in India. And when Paramahansa Yogananda came here, he sought out Evans-Wentz and said, "You can stay here whenever you need to. You know, you're a friend of my teacher." And so we did. And so the last 2 weeks of his life, he said, "No, I'm not going to die here." So we went around to some of the nursing homes in Encinitas, found the right one, went there, and died. Interesting. Now, he would be one of the first. He had a tendency to believe everything he read as being the gospel, as it were. Until it was proven otherwise, he just would go on from there. But by and large, he had this incredible memory for things and all that. And he would take these Christian hardliners to task. In fact, when, after World War II, a fellow theosophist, Basil Crump, started saying, "You know, you can't trust Dawa Sandup, Mr. Wentz, because he wasn't a theosophist, and basically he was married." And the only time that Evans-Wentz ever took anybody to task publicly, 25-page rebuttal. And that just shut the whole matter up on that. And he wouldn't hear anything said against his guru. He wouldn't hear anything said against the fairy faith or the theosophist unless he said it himself. And as far as he was concerned, he kept the honor going there. And that's what I respect about him the most. He really pointed the way for a lot of us. Now, that's really less than a thumbnail sketch, I'm sorry, but if any of you have any questions at all about his life or what he did or didn't do, shout them out. Or reactions thereof. Or rumors you may have heard.
Would you mind telling me what exactly the Tibetan Book of the Dead was translated from? What manuscript is that, and can you give me some background on the tradition of that?
Okay, it's a breviary for reading over a dead or dying person. It basically is taking them through 3 situations: when they're dying, an intermediate stage, and the rebirth stage. At any point during these 49 days that they describe that you're in this. Now that 49 days that you're in the after-death plane can be 49 Earth days or something like that. Depends on who you talk to. You can step away from being reborn. I think this is what attracted Evans-Wentz very deeply, because from his days studying Theosophy, he believed firmly in reincarnation. So as you're dying, what the monk or the Lama is doing is that they're reading, "Oh, nobly born, you are facing this. Don't worry, it's an emanation of your own mind." And it goes on, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper until you get all these screaming demons around you, want to cut you up and throw you on hot metal and all this. And all of a sudden, after you get through those two stages, you come to seeing couples making love and you're attracted to that. At any time, you can say, okay, this is what is happening. I can step to one side. It's okay. I can be reborn at a different level. My biography of him, Pilgrim of the Clear Light, refers to the clear light that you see at the moment of death. Now, this has been described in other religious groups, but what you see in the Tibetan situation is that if you just sort of step into or give into that light, basically you're off the rebirth schedule.
I have a couple little stories about Evans-Wentz you might want to know. As he lived down in the Keystone Hotel, there was an old bookstore here in town called Warren Brock's. You probably knew it. Warren Brock, old man Warren Brock, was a Baptist. And of course, Evans-Wentz frequented the store, and they had lots of arguments all the time because Evans-Wentz was always talking about reincarnation, and Warren Brock really didn't really want to hear any of it. And I was told by the people that used to work for Warren Brock later that Warren Brock used to see Evans-Wentz walking by the window of his store. And after Evans-Wentz died, you know, and it just so I think he was being haunted.
One of the clerks told me that basically he saw him after he died in the building.
Okay.
He'd go down there and read. I used to do that myself, read the books down the basement.
That's probably right.
Wow.
Then.
Thank you. That's
Let's see now. There's another one. It'll come back to me, and I'll do it again.
Okay.
Oh, yes, there was. I was in the San Diego Library one time, and a book jumped off the shelf at me, and it was Ramana Maharshi's. Somebody had spent 2 or 3 years with Ramana Maharshi, copying down everything he had said, all the answers to questions that he had, and Evans-Wentz came in. It must have been in the early 40s during the war, I think. And
late 30s.
Late 30s,
yeah.
Maybe? Okay, and he was asking him lots of questions, Ramana Maharshi, and of course Ramana Maharshi just kept saying, "Who is this you're talking about?" You know, so.
Yeah, at one point he said, "Well, when's a good time to meditate?" Maharshi said, "What's time?"
Yeah.
He said, "Well, I want to know, when do you," he says, "Who's the you you're speaking about?"
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm not so sure what he picked up there, but Ramana Maharshi basically said, you know, look at the question.
That's right. Along with those, I'll mention some other ones in the Ramana Maharshi just because everybody here will get a kick out of it. He had just been talking to what he called a bunch of Theosophical ladies that had just come in from Adyar, asking him about all of the times what they were doing in their dream state when they were asleep. And of course he said the same thing, "Who is this you're talking about?" You know? We own the mountain across the way from Evens-Wentz. We have a little booklet called La Frente de Dios, the forehead of God, which is what the natives called the mountain that Evens-Wentz owned. It's the forehead where the boys would go up for their vision quests when they come of age. And Evens-Wentz said it was on the plateau that was going out toward the west of the mountain.
It's up there. Go up. Couple more. Yeah, you did. No, one more. That's it.
Well, that's a vision from the top looking down at the place where they did their ceremonies out toward the west, I think.
So that's the second plateau.
On a clear day, you can see forever out there.
And I've been there.
Oops, lost it here. So in the booklet, they're talking about this is a great forehead of God, right? Looking up at the heavens, and so this is the forehead, and Mount Otay is the nose, and La Playa down in Tijuana, the estuary of the Tijuana River, is the mouth. And then, of course, in Tecate is the left eye, and in where we are in Madre Grande is the right eye. So it's one big face looking up into the heavens that you only see in shamanic journey. So people are still looking for a cave on that mountain, and there is a tradition that there's something there, but nobody's found it yet.
Good enough, thanks. Good information.
And he bequeathed all of the mountain. I was once talking to Emmett Small in his house and said I was looking for something on the mountain. And of course Emmett swung around in his chair, opened a drawer in his file cabinet, and pulled out the information I was looking for, which was the last will and testament of Evans-Wentz, where he dedicated that mountain for all people at all times. And so it's still a semi-public park that you can go up, and if you have that information in hand, the Border Patrol won't send you away.
Is that recently they won't send you away?
That's recent, yes.
Okay, good.
Yes, but you better know because it's in the deed. It's in the deed, so you have to know that.
Okay. All right. Anybody else?
So we must have met at the vegetarian cafe.
Very possibly. I used to go there when the place was jammed.
Yeah, I only have a few memories, but of course my father would visit Evans-Wentz fairly often, especially as Wentz got older. So I remember going to the vegetarian cafe in the late 1950s, the women in their uniforms, and I was commenting later, "Is Mr. Wentz all right?" I think I was 7, you know. Also going up Kuchuma.
One of his later disciples, a man named Joe Miller, who was sort of a teacher of his own right in San Francisco, came down once, and Evans-Wentz took him to the House of Nutrition, saying, "We're going to have a lunch," you know. So Mr. Miller didn't know what to make of it. So he brought him in there, and all the waitresses made a big fuss over Evans-Wentz because he was there all the time and everything. And they were asking him, "Dr. Wentz, where's your girlfriend?" And so Miller was telling me, he said, "Oh my gosh, what's going to happen now?" Because he knew it was kind of stiff, and he sort of went, "I left her at home." And so, what? And they joked about him. He thought it was really quite funny and everything. So Miller was trying to be very nice to his guru and says, "You're going to eat hearty. Don't worry about what they say." And so he kept pushing all this food on Miller, and he had garbanzo bean salad, one bean at a time he would eat. "Oh, eat more, whatever you want to drink," one at a time. And I thought, oh my. And that sort of Mr. Miller thought that too. He just said, Evans-Wentz didn't seem to, food just didn't make any difference to him where or what he ate. Vegetarian, yes. But if he didn't eat that afternoon or that morning, it didn't seem to bother him too much. He was living on a diet of oatmeal and dried fruit when he was living in Sikkim. Someone, Dalva Sandup's son told me, he says, we never could figure out what else he ate. Because he was very happy about that. And then he would, if he was going off on tour, which in India, you end up taking a cook, which he did, which really helped him, he would just have very simple vegetarian fare. Lentils and rice and overcooked vegetables. And that was just fine. Okay, well, I don't know if I answered any questions or bored you out of your mind about this. He's been quite a man to study, quite a man to have involved in your life. My mentor, the late Dr. John Theobald, was a good friend of Evans-Wentz, and he introduced me to the possibilities of this man. I remember 1974, my whole life changed on that. He says, oh, you'll write a story about him, you know. He has this mountain. And so I thought, okay, anybody who owns a mountain can't be bad. And 5 years later, out comes the biography, and I thought, oh, now, what am I going to start? But just getting into this man's life, even in a small amount, then it taught me that you never know what you're going to find until you go below the surface of any given situation. And this includes anybody who's spiritual. You think, oh, well, there can't be much there. You'd be surprised. Now, he was from a certain era. The people that he knew, the people that I knew through him, all are gone now. They were like the pioneers of everything, including this guy, Paul Brunton, who wrote all these books about yoga and about looking for the masters in the Himalayas. They were friends. Lama Anagarika Govinda, the German Tibetan monk. All of these people were very stellar. They're very different than the people you get now. These men and women were practitioners. A lot of the modern scholars here are not practitioners. And there's a difference. Some of the great photographers who are going to places where Evans-Wentz wanted to go, or Lama Govinda went, took pictures and all this sort of thing. They didn't have the same interaction with the locale. They made mistakes in describing something that a practitioner wouldn't. And that, to me, was important because he went to visit all of these people and places with a different frame of mind than I see with a lot of people nowadays. And that's what really intrigued me. And so when I read what they say at certain things, or if they criticize him or something, I look and say, what are they really saying? What are we really seeing right here? Because nowadays, these same people, they don't write journals. They don't write letters. It's all digital. And it can be erased, just like that. And that bothers me because I went all over the place looking for letters in India, Oxford, Stanford, and here. And I learned an awful lot about the man through these letters that you're not going to get in email. And that's made all the difference. Okay, thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay. Well, sorry to disturb you in leaving, but there is one question, and I popped them up already before. Can you give us some information? What is the best edition available from his work, from the Tibetan Book of the Dead?
The best edition of his work. This is the 2000 edition, Oxford University Press. It's exactly the original. The difference is Donald Lopez doing the introduction to it. Lama Govinda has made his commentary, and Dr. Young has made his commentary, and a couple of other gentlemen have. Oxford University Press did not want to change any of the templates of this because it would cost them money, and they consider this a secondary book. It's not something they're going to make a lot of money on. So they went at the end of the war, World War II, when Lama Govinda was learned on a different edition or different copy of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Oxford wouldn't touch it. Said, no, we're not going to do it. The German edition did put them all in, all Lama Govinda's corrections, but they went bust. So that was lost. And so what Evans-Wentz did is have Lama Govinda write an introduction to this edition, the last two editions, outlining a few of the things that weren't in the book itself. But by and large, after studying it last week, I don't think he added that much to it. If you read Dr. Young's introduction and you really read closely what Evans-Wentz has said himself, I mean closely, it gets tedious and it gets trying, but it's amazing what you can pick up. You look for the patterns of what he's trying to say and what he pushes you back to consider, like a good teacher. So I think any of these, the current edition of the Oxford would probably be better. I'm not sure what's available in European languages right now. It all depends on who Oxford University has an agreement with. But if it's somebody giving an interpretation, I'd be careful. If you all read English, get this one here. You'll be okay.
Okay.
Great. Thank you very much.